welcome back. Today we are going to talk about accessibility switches. Accessibility switches are different types of buttons or other shaped switches that allow a user to turn something on or off or to change some sort of setting on a device by activating the switch. When you think about this in day-to-day life, we use switches all the time. We use light switches. You use a button to open and close your garage door. You may use a switch or button to open up a automatic door when your hands are full. For a user with a disability or minimal movement, an accessibility switch allows them to have better access to things in their environment. Switches can also be used for things like activating a computer or controlling an iPad or a tablet. So, by using an accessibility switch or multiple accessibility switches, a user with limited mobility can have a lot more access in their day-to-day life. We're going to take a look at some different types of switches today so that you can see what they are and what they do. One example of a switch is this simple one. This is considered a jelly bean switch. As you can tell, it has a small base. It has some holes on the bottom, so these can be anchored to a surface. And when this presses down, you can hear a little bit of a click, and this is activating the switch, similar to if you were flipping a light switch. It turns something either on or off. It activates that switch. On the other end of this is a cord that goes to a little plug. You might recognize these a lot of times. These were used for things like headphones, Walkmans, all of those things back in the day. But this is the type of plug that comes with an accessibility switch, or most of them anyway. What that does then is connects to something that is designed to work with an accessibility switch. The example I have here is just a fun little Mickey Mouse toy that sings. And he has a little wire that's coming out of him, and he has the plug on the opposite end. So when I plug these two together, and they just fit together like this. Now, as you know, most of these toys typically have like a button in their hand or their foot that you'll push and it will activate and start singing or dancing or whatever these toys do. This one has been modified, so instead of squeezing the hand, you need to activate whatever switch is plugged into this end. So I'm going to turn Mickey on and we're going to hope he doesn't start singing at me right away. Okay, now he's turned on. Now, when I take this switch and activate it,
Hey everybody, it's me.
he's going to start singing. Now, if I activate it again, the next message will play.
Let's wiggle till we giggle.
Okay, I'm going to stop it by hitting the switch again. So instead of squeezing the hand, now we have this switch. Because of the length of the cord, this switch can be placed in any location that is easy for the user to activate. So this could be hit with a hand. This could be placed up by someone's head so they could hit it with their head. It could be placed by someone's knee or someone's foot. So any place that that person has enough movement to be able to activate this switch, the other end can be plugged into things like, for little kids, toys, or other devices like switch-activated radios or music players, musical instruments. There are tons and tons and tons of switch-activated devices out there. Some switches even can be used to pair up to things like computers or iPads so that you can activate a switch to trigger things on the device. So once a user is able to use a switch to trigger something like a toy or any other cause and effect tool, it can then be used for other things like computer access or tablet access, which then gets the user into things like word processing, email, internet access, etc. As you can see behind me here, I do have some other switches, so let's switch over and look at some of these other switch types. So here I have a variety of different types of switches. Earlier, we had talked about the jelly bean switch, which is just kind of a round, small switch. Again, has some things on the back so that it can be mounted. When you press it, it activates. A lot of these come with a cover that comes off, and the color on top is interchangeable, which means you can do different colors for different types of tasks. There are also switches very similar in look to this, but are bigger if the user needs a bigger surface area to be able to touch. Now, there are a variety of other switches that are very similar to this one. For example, there is this switch from Enabling Devices. It activates very similarly by pressing down. The difference with this one you'll see is kind of the shape of this switch. So this switch is easier if you have a user that maybe can't get their hand all the way up over the top of the switch. This one can activate just by hitting the edge of it or coming at it from an angle. So again, these are both going to work very similarly just by pushing down. Up here, you'll also see kind of a bigger, taller, little blockier switch. This is actually a switch that has been 3D printed. So the exterior of this was designed by a 3D printer, and inside is actually just a standard switch that you can get at the hardware store that has been screwed in and soldered from the bottom. You can sort of see in here a little bit. And now when this switch is pressed, it activates whatever this is plugged into. And again, there's just a top that's been 3D printed to activate that way. So these are all switches that are just activated simply by pushing down, and the other end is plugged into the device. So these are sort of button switches. There's a lot of different varieties of these, different shapes. You can get some that are more sensory. They might have like a texture on top to kind of give it a little extra sensory input when they're used. So let's slide those sort of up and off to the side here. Up here in the corner, I do have, this is called an alternate spinner. And what this does when the button is pushed, the spinner spins. Now I might not actually have batteries in it. Oh, there we go. It wasn't turned on all the way. So this is an example of, again, a device that can be used by plugging a switch into it. Okay, so other types of switches. So in addition to just simple button switches like this, there are other switches that can be used in alternative ways. Here are a couple of examples. This one is actually a sound-activated switch. So this one, you can adjust the sensitivity here for the microphone. You plug the device in here using, again, one of these cords that go from device to device. So again, I'm just going to plug this from one end here and one into the other device. And this time when the user makes noise, it's going to trigger the switch. So now instead of pressing something, we're simply going to have the user make noise, and that is going to trigger the switch. Another type of switch trigger is a sensor switch. So this can be used, here's an example of one of the sensors. This can be used by plugging the sensor into this device and then this device out to whatever switch activated device like our Mickey or our alternate spinner here. And this time, this switch actually works by being bent. So this works really well if you have a user with limited mobility. Use a piece of medical grade tape and tape one piece here and one piece here on the user, and when they bend it. So this could be used maybe on the face that somebody's going to raise their eyebrows and it's going to bend it. Or it could be used if somebody bends their finger and it's going to bend it. Any movement that the user has that can bend this little piece of flexible metal in here will trigger the switch with this box. So again, just like pushing those buttons, but this time it's going to be with a sensor. In addition to those types of switches, we also have other types of switches that work off of a movement. This switch, okay, can be worn around the back of the neck and can be triggered by the user opening and closing their mouth to trigger this switch. I'm not sure if the mic will pick up the noise, the little clicking noise, but when this is triggered, it will trigger the switch. So again, this works really well for maybe a jaw opening and closing. But again, it can be positioned in many different ways to get wherever the user has enough movement to be able to trigger this switch. Along with those, we do have some various ways to control an iPad, a tablet, or a computer. And these are some of the devices that can help with that. And now again, there are a variety of different brands of these and different styles of these. I just have a few examples here. This one is a Praetorian USB switch. So the back of this here plugs into the computer. And then if you look at the back here, I'll bring it up so you can see it. Here you can choose what this does. So you can change the channel and the mode. And this button can become a left click, a right click, an arrow, a space, an enter, any of those things by triggering this switch. So when this is plugged into a computer, anytime you set these to whichever you want, and then when this is triggered, that becomes your enter or your down arrow, whatever you have it set for. Just like that, this is another version of a USB. This is actually a hitch. So what this does is allows you to plug a switch into this. So this is not a switch itself. This would get plugged into, okay, for example, switch 1 down here. And now depending on which mode you pick, this could become your up arrow or your space bar or your mouse movement up, your space bar, your up arrow, or you can set a custom combination here. So again, you could plug in up to 5 different switches. There's some preset things that will happen or some customizable options. And this allows this switch to become these functions on your computer. So again, using a switch to access a computer. The final switch that I have as an example here today is called a Bluetooth. There is a newer model of this now that looks a little bit different that just came out. Concept's the same. It's a little lighter touch. But this is actually a Bluetooth switch. So instead of plugging this into your computer or your iPad or your tablet, you are going to connect it by Bluetooth, okay, using the pairing button over here on the side. And then these become 1 and 2 switches to control or trigger things on the iPad or computer. Now, this one you'll also notice does have a couple of switch buttons here. So this can also be used if you want to connect to a computer or an iPad or a tablet, but maybe the user can't access this type of switch. You could plug this switch into this. And then this switch works the same as switch 1. So this gets Bluetooth connected to the device, and then this switch actually is what triggers it. This just kind of becomes the Bluetooth connection to the iPad or the computer. So again, these are just a few varieties of switches. There's a lot more out there. This is kind of a baseline of the types of things that a user can use to access. So again, if somebody is able to make a noise, right, or a slight movement with a sensor or hit a switch, they then can access things like the alternate spinner or our Mickey Mouse here, or music, or any of those things, and even up to the point of being able to use these types of devices to access a computer or a tablet. So as you can tell here, there are a lot of different switches and ways to provide access to things using switches. In later videos, we're going to talk about ways to use switches to do different art activities, access the computer, and a variety of things. But if you have a user that has limited mobility and is struggling to access the world around them, a switch is a really great tool to start to explore so that you're able to find a way for that person to access all of the things in their future, even including the internet and iPads, tablets, computers, communication, and more. Thank you for watching. Stick around, like, subscribe, follow, do all of those things so that you can catch our future videos when we will talk more about how to use switches, different types of switches, and even possibly create some activities or devices that work with switches.